Okay, number 19, as you look at problem number 19, I'm going to go ahead and jump to the bottom. It's an extraordinarily long problem, so I'm going to look at what the answer is. And basically what we're looking for is, I'm sorry, it actually says it in the first sentence. How much must the buyer bring to closing in the following transaction? In other words, what we're asking here is a mini, M-I-N-I, a mini closing statement. We're not solving the seller side, just the buyer side. Knowing that there are going to be a lot of numbers here, what I like to do is set it up in such a way that we have the buyer, and you know that the buyer is going to have debits, and you know that the buyer is going to have credits. Once I have it set up, I go back and I just read the problem, start plugging things into place where they logically make sense. So the sale price of the property is $250,000. Well, the buyer needs to somehow come up with $250,000. And let me go back for just a second to give you these definitions. When you look at the debit for a buyer, a debit to the buyer is just money he's trying to come up with at closing, something he has to pay for at closing. A credit to the buyer is anything that reduces the amount of money that he has to bring to closing. So certainly the sale price of $250,000 is his ultimate debit. That's how much money he's trying to come up with. So let's put $250 in the buyer's column. I label that as sale price, so I know I've dealt with that issue. The way he's going to pay for this loan, if you continue reading the first sentence, is the buyer is to obtain an 80% loan-to-value mortgage. So the bank is going to give him, the bank is going to send money in to closing. It'll sit in the attorney's trust account until closing, show up as a credit for the buyer. 80% of $250,000 is $200,000. So let's plug that in, $200,000. Buyer credit for the loan. And I know it sounds strange to think of a loan as being a credit, but the fact is that this money is coming to closing today, so that's less money that the buyer has to bring to closing. The bank is charging 1 point for loan origination and 1 discount point to obtain his 5 and 3.75 mortgage rate. Let's stop right here for just a second. The bank is charging 1 point for loan origination and 1 point for discount. And in this particular case, obviously it's the buyer's loan, so the buyer is going to pay these. Don't forget, the calculation for points is always 1% of the loan amount. Be careful, grab the loan amount. $200,000 times 1% is a debit of $2,000 for the loan origination fee. I'm just calling it LOF, loan origination fee. $2,000 for 1 discount point. And they are both debited to the buyer. His rate will be important in just a moment. An appraisal is $300 and a credit report is $75, but look at this next sentence. Both of which were paid at the time of loan application. When you're doing a mini closing statement, if something was paid at the time of the loan application, it has no effect on the money changing hands today. You can completely ignore it. This is not uncommon for credit apps and for appraisals. The closing will take place on May 24th. I bet that's going to be important in just a moment. And the buyer will pay interim interest through the end of the month. Okay, this is the first place it's going to be important. Buyer always pays interim interest, right? Mm-hmm. It's the interest at the end of the month. And unless we tell you otherwise, every month has 30 days. And this is the only place that you use the +1, is interim interest, okay? So, do we know the buyer's beginning loan balance? $200,000. Do we know the buyer's interest rate? Yes. 5.375%. Somebody help me with those numbers, please. $10,750?
Yeah.
$10,750. That was important only from the standpoint of you need to figure out what the daily interest is. So once I figure out the annual interest, I divide it by 360 because we're using a 360-day year. And of course, how much does that come out to per day?
29.86.
29, how much?
86.
86? 29.86 roughly. Okay, could be a rounding issue there, but it won't be enough to mess you up on these problems, okay? Now, interim interest, if we're closing on May 24th, is that in the picture? Okay. If we're closing on May 24th, and there are 30 days per month, 30 days minus 24th, the day of closing, plus the day of closing, equals how many days of interim interest? 7. 2986 per day times 7 days. Give me a rough figure on that.
209.
209. We're going to say 209 even?
Yes.
Okay. Probably a rounding issue there. We just truncated, right? Okay. Perfect. Yeah, in that case, I would just round it. So 209. Notice where I put it. I put it in the buyer's debit column. Does that make sense? It's the buyer's loan, so the buyer's paying interim interest for those 7 days. Real property taxes for the year are $1,440. Let's go ahead and deal with those. In dealing with the property taxes, a lot of times when I'm doing these problems, I'll go ahead and think about it in my mind. The taxes clearly have not been paid because we never reached September 1st. We know we're taking from the seller, which is interesting, but the seller's not in this problem, and giving to the buyer. So how is this going to appear to the buyer? As a debit or a credit?
A credit.
This is going to be a buyer credit. He's going to get a credit for these taxes because he's going to pay them later in the year. If they're $1,440 for the year, see that's taxes right there, $1,440 for the year, divided by 360, the taxes are $4 per day. Be careful right here, closing on May 24th, how many days credit is the buyer going to get?
144.
144, and here's why. January, February, March, April, 4 months times 30 days is 120, plus the 24 days in March. So 144 days times $4 per day,
576.
$576, and I know it would have been a debit to the seller, but he's not here. So we're just going to plug it in as a credit to the buyer. I'm going to use RPT, real property taxes, to show my credit there. Does everybody feel good about that logic? Okay. Not always the case, because remember, tax prorations depend on what time of year it's closing. We're getting close, so let's see what else is going on here. The real property, other cost totaled 2,300? Other costs total 2,300. I didn't tell you what they are, but I mean they're closing costs. So we're going to charge those to the buyer, right? I'm just going to put CC, closing costs, 2,300. Then be careful about these next two right here. And the buyer paid $2,000 for due diligence and $2,000 for earnest money. What happens to due diligence and earnest money on the buyer's side at the time of closing? Credit. He gets a credit for the due diligence fee. Why? Because the contract says that if the buyer closes, he gets credit for his due diligence fee. He also gets credit for $2,000 for the earnest money because it has been sitting at a trust account waiting for closing, and at closing it shows up as a credit to the buyer. At this point, do we have everything plugged into place?
Yes.
Okay. Add up all your debits. Looks like that's $256,509. Somebody check that number, please.
That is correct.
Okay.
I concur. That is correct.
And on the credits, looks like 202,776.
Yes.
What problem is that? Does that match the answer, Keith?
Yeah.
Okay, so those numbers didn't sound familiar, but they look right. And then the last step, of course, is if this buyer has debits of $256,509, credits of $202,776, subtract the credits from the debits, and it looks like it's going to be 53 something? 733? 733. And what does that represent? Buyer brings certified funds, $53,733 to closing. Mini closing statement. Good?